There was a cabin at the far end of the county where no children played outside and no neighbors were ever invited in. Curtains never opened. Windows were dark even in the middle of summer. Folks passing by said the place looked more like a prison than a home. But inside, a man ruled with a silence thicker than any lock. He was father to many, but husband too. His name rarely appeared in records, yet his shadow stretched across generations. Two of his daughters were not simply raised under his roof, they were wed beneath it. There were no ceremonies, no licenses, no witnesses. Only a single man tightening his grip on blood that was never meant to be bound this way. The family never walked into town together, never sat in church, never traded at the market. When people asked questions, they got no answers. And when a stranger once dared to knock at the cabin door, it was one of the daughters who answered. She was pale, silent, her eyes wide and glassy, as if rehearsed to say nothing. Behind her, another girl lingered in the shadows, same face, same stillness. Both carried his name, both carried his ring. This was not rumor. This was the beginning of America's most disturbing family tragedy. By the early 1900s, whispers of the cabin spread through the valley. Neighbors avoided the road that wound past it, saying the air grew heavy the closer you came, as though the woods themselves knew to keep outsiders away. Farmers driving wagons through the hills swore they saw children at the edge of the trees, watching but never speaking, never smiling. The man at the center of it all, father, husband, patriarch, was said to be a man with no fear of the law. His family seldom appeared in public, and when they did, their names never matched the county records. Birth dates overlapped. One girl listed herself as both sister and mother. Another boy was recorded twice, once as a son, once as a nephew. It was a genealogy that made no sense, a lineage bent backward on itself like a crooked branch. The daughters he wed lived in silence, moving through the cabin like shadows. No one heard them speak in town, no one saw them with friends. To the world outside, they simply did not exist, but inside the house, they bore him children. Children who, over time, grew to look more and more alike. Round faces, hollow eyes, an uncanny sameness that unsettled even the bravest visitor. One schoolteacher recalled a boy arriving in her class with papers marked by the county clerk. The child's last name was the same as the father's, yet his mother was listed as both daughter and wife. The teacher raised questions, but her notes mysteriously vanished from the records. Weeks later, she left the county altogether. It wasn't safe to ask questions, an old colleague remembered. By the 1920s, rumors turned darker. A preacher who visited the home swore he saw two young women at the supper table, both dressed in faded white gowns, both with rings carved crudely from bone. He left before the meal was finished, muttering to the townsfolk that he had walked into something unholy. Days later, he stopped speaking of it altogether, and within months, he left the region entirely. The daughters themselves, two brides bound to one man, remained hidden behind drawn curtains. Their voices were never heard outside the walls of the house. Yet neighbors claimed they could hear crying carried on the wind at night, muffled by the mountain fog. And though no wedding bells ever rang, the truth was whispered in kitchens, in church basements, in hushed conversations. The man had taken not one but two of his daughters as his wives. The town's officials pretended not to notice. No sheriff came knocking, no judge demanded records. Some say it was fear, the fear of stepping into a home where bloodlines twisted into something unspeakable. Others believed it was a kind of willful blindness, because if you put it down in ink, if you gave it words, then the shame became undeniable. But the shame already lived in the hollow, breathing through its children, multiplying with each birth. A curse, some called it. A sickness, others said. Whatever name it bore, one truth spread through the valley. This was not simply a family, it was a cycle that would not break on its own, and with every passing year the silence deepened. By the 1930s, the man's legacy was no longer whispered, it was visible. The children born inside the cabin carried the weight of their father's choices in their faces, their posture, even the way they walked. Locals who saw them described a sameness that went beyond family resemblance. Their eyes were set too wide, their faces round but oddly expressionless, as if molded from the same fragile clay. Their hair grew in thin patches, their skin pale as candle wax. Most unsettling of all, their eyes, dark, hollow, ringed with shadows, seemed to follow outsiders with a stare that felt less like curiosity and more like warning. A traveling salesman once told of stopping near the homestead to ask for water. He claimed that 4 children stood on the porch in silence, lined side by side like dolls in a row. None of them spoke. None even blinked. The oldest, a girl of perhaps 12, carried a baby on her hip. The salesman swore her face was nearly identical to the baby's, like the same child at 2 different ages. He left without filling his canteen and never returned to that part of the county again. At school, the children struggled. Some could barely form words. Others refused to speak altogether. A teacher described them as watchful but empty, always waiting for instructions, never laughing, never joining games. Their papers were often left blank, their books unmarked. They seemed to live in a world where names, dates, even letters, carried no meaning, where identity itself dissolved into silence. By adolescence, the girls began to vanish from the schoolhouse. Records list them as withdrawn, with no explanation. Town gossip filled the silence with dread. They were being prepared for the same fate as their mothers, to remain in the cabin, to carry children of their own. It was a cycle so relentless that outsiders began to call the family cursed, though no one dared say it aloud near the hollow. One doctor who examined a newborn from the family wrote a note in his ledger. Features consistent with close relation breeding. Prognosis poor. That child, locals later claimed, lived only a few weeks, and yet the births continued. Year after year, more infants arrived, their features growing stranger, their voices quieter, their eyes wider. The house itself became a symbol. Curtains never opened, doors never left ajar, windows nailed shut from within. The cabin was not a home, but a chamber, an enclosure where time folded in on itself. Outsiders began to cross the road rather than pass too near. They swore they could hear children crying from the woods at dusk, though no child was ever seen outside after dark. What was most disturbing was not just the condition of the children, but the community's refusal to intervene. The sheriff dismissed the rumors as family business. The church turned away, unwilling to confront what its own congregation whispered. Even county officials avoided the property, their records deliberately left vague, full of blank spaces, where names and ages should have been. And so the children lived unseen, growing in silence under the same roof where their father had married his daughters. They became ghosts before their time, alive but hidden, flesh and blood reminders of a truth too heavy for the valley to face. By mid-century, the family's name was no longer spoken in town. Yet the sight of those children, pale, silent, staring, lingered in the minds of anyone unlucky enough to pass the cabin. Because in their faces, you did not see just one man's sin. You saw the proof of generations bending inward, collapsing under the weight of their own blood. And still, the cycle turned. By the 1940s, the story of the family had seeped into the valley like a sickness no one wanted to name. Outsiders did not speak of it openly, but the people who lived closest could not escape the whispers. Farmers working their fields claimed they heard voices drifting down from the hollow at night, low chanting, the sound of women crying. sometimes laughter that ended too abruptly. Hunters who cut across the ridge said they stumbled on strange signs, crude wooden figures nailed to trees, scraps of children's clothing buried under stones, faint trails leading to shallow pits covered hastily with earth. The cabin itself had grown larger. Neighbors noticed additions, lean-to rooms, patched walls, and smoke rising at odd hours. Yet no one ever saw new timber delivered. No one heard the ring of hammers. It was as if the structure grew from itself, twisting outward like a living thing. Those who dared draw near described a stench that clung to the air. Rot, damp wood, something faintly sweet and nauseating like spoiled fruit. Chickens and dogs, left tied too long, often starved on the property's edge. Some said the family treated animals the same way they treated their daughters, not as creatures with life of their own, but as tools, bound by silence. In town, the evidence surfaced in small, unsettling fragments. A midwife confided that the same man's name appeared on birth records generation after generation. A store clerk swore he saw a girl, barely 16, already heavy with child, escorted into the shop by her father, who would not let her speak, even to ask for sugar. A preacher, pressed by concerned parishioners, attempted to intervene, but returned pale and trembling. "That house," he whispered, "is not ruled by God." By then, the children's appearance had become impossible to ignore. They moved in groups, their features so eerily alike that strangers assumed them to be twins or triplets, though they were born years apart. Their eyes, wide, hollow, fixed, haunted the people who caught glimpses of them at the edges of the forest. Some carried strange marks on their skin, too many fingers, a jaw too small for the mouth it held, limbs that bent in ways they shouldn't. Still, the valley looked away. To acknowledge the truth would mean facing their own failure to stop it, their own guilt in letting the horror grow unchecked. And so, they buried it beneath gossip and silence, letting the whispers replace action. But silence does not erase, it only festers. And in the hollow, that silence had become its own kind of curse, binding the family tighter than blood, shielding the patriarch as his daughters grew older, their children multiplying within the shadow of the same house. By mid-century, some claimed the man was no longer just a father or even a grandfather, but a patriarch of 3 generations, each one tied to him by a bond that defied law, morality, even comprehension. The whispers hardened into warnings. Don't go near that ridge. Don't follow the sound of children. Don't look too long at the house with its curtains drawn, because what lived inside was not just a family. It was the echo of a choice made long ago. A choice that had swallowed every daughter, every child, every name. And still, the valley remained silent. By the 1960s, the family line had thinned, but the curse had not broken. Only a few remained in the hollow, and with them, the patriarch, aged, gaunt, but still holding the house in his grip. His hair had turned white, yet his eyes never lost that hollow sharpness. To outsiders, he looked frail. To his daughters, he was still master, father, and husband all at once. Locals whispered that 2 of his daughters, grown women who had never known a life beyond the ridge, remained bound to him. Both bore his children, though no one could say how many survived. Those who glimpsed the daughters described them as mirror images, their faces eerily similar, their movements slow and almost puppet-like, as though drained of their own will. One neighbor swore he saw them walking hand in hand at dusk, their bellies swollen again, their eyes cast downward as if ashamed. The cabin sagged into rot, but still the windows stayed covered. Still the smoke rose, and still the screams came. In the night, a new preacher, younger and full of fire, climbed the ridge, determined to deliver the daughters. He came back broken, muttering only one sentence. Some marriages are sealed deeper than flesh. Soon after, the cabin burned. Flames licked the sky, devouring walls that had stood for nearly a century. When neighbors rushed to help, no bodies were found among the ashes. Some claimed the Patriarch and his daughters fled into the woods. Others believed the fire consumed them all, leaving only bones too small, too twisted to identify. The official record closed the case with silence. No investigation, no graves, just one more erasure in a valley filled with them. But the land remembers. Hunters say they still hear voices in the trees, children whispering, "Papa," in tones too strange to be love. Travelers swear they see figures watching from the shadows, pale and identical, faces blurred by darkness. And so the story lives on, not in documents or names, but in whispers. The man who married his own daughters, the children who never chose to be born, the house that grew like a living wound, feeding on silence. It is a story no one wanted to record, but a story the land itself refuses to forget.